So many people who had no history of heart illnesses have got it now, or blood clotting after the COVID-19 vaccination. Punish those who hurt people with COVID madness, lighting the fuse for freedom. TNT Radio.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the program. This is TNT, Today's News Talk. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. We're still in the first hour. Now, we're going to do a pivot right now over to the Middle East. Now, yesterday we spoke to international human rights lawyer Mohammed Akunji about this very dire situation that is unfolding right now in Rafah, southern Gaza, where you have refugees accumulating, internally displaced persons, those who have survived the Israeli onslaught in northern Gaza and southern Gaza, pushed into the area of Rafah. And it does appear, at least from the statements by many Israeli officials, that there are plans afoot to push hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, whoever survives anyway, the upcoming Israeli assault, into the Egyptian desert in the Sinai Peninsula. That would be the most horrific outcome imaginable. Certainly it flies in the face of everything that was put on the table at the International Courts of Justice last month by the South African delegation invoking the Genocide Convention. But yet here we are. It is really the most extraordinary situation imaginable, and nobody seems to be able to do anything about it to abate the fait accompli that we are watching unfold before our eyes. But we're going to try to analyze this situation with our next guest, who has been watching this closely and is also a scholar and a historian and very familiar with the history of the formation of the State of Israel and the history of Palestine as well. He's joining us on the line right now. Dr. Zachary Foster, thank you for joining us.
Patrick, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Zach, the situation right now, I mean, how can you sum this up right now, where we're at? I know when we last talked, this wasn't really the issue, but now this is the issue. What do you make of the situation that's building up in Rafah right now?
Well, we've known Israel's plan since late October. The Israeli Ministry of Defense leaked a document already, 3-4 months ago, which outlined the plan. And it's been the same plan for months now, which is that Israel wants to ultimately take control over the Gaza Strip, and it wants to push all of its 2.2 million residents out into Egypt, into North Sinai. And we're seeing the final stages of that plan unfold in real time as we speak, which is that you have 1.4 million Palestinians displaced, living in open air camps, in tents, if they're lucky, starving to death as we speak. Every single Palestinian in Gaza is going hungry. I think the numbers are something like 90% of Palestinians are going at least a 1 day, a 24-hour period without food. That is the overwhelming majority of Palestinians. So they're starving. They don't have access to clean water. You have thousands and thousands of Palestinians sharing a single toilet, no access to any kind of sanitation facilities. And now the end is near. The Israeli government has declared that unless all of the hostages will be released by Ramadan, which is early March, they're planning to push Palestinians across the border, ethnically cleanse millions of people in what amounts to a kind of a Nakba 2.0, the second ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. And we see on the Egyptian side, we had reports already from over a week and a half ago, that the Egyptian government is building another wall to be able to enclose these millions of Palestinians between basically the Israeli border on the one hand and a kind of a wall built slightly into the Egyptian side of the of the Rafah border, and that is the fate that millions of Palestinians are facing.
Do you think there's a possibility here? I mean, well, it's kind of a obvious question, but that there's coordination behind the scenes between Tel Aviv, Cairo, and Washington, D.C., that this is, in fact, the plan is just not being said publicly or admitted explicitly, but there's coordination because between all of these parties, certainly there'd be absolute uproar from other parts of the Middle East, the Arab world, the Muslim world, if you will, more broadly, Europe, other countries in the global South, that if this indeed is being formulated in advance, the collusion of these three states to do this, I mean, it's just unthinkable. What are your thoughts politically on this?
I would be surprised if there wasn't collusion and coordination. The Egyptian government is hundreds of billions of dollars in debt. The Egyptian government is not able to repay its U.S. dollar denominated a debt. And so in the past number of years, every 5 or 10 or 15 years, Egypt devalues the Egyptian pound to inflate the money supply to be able to pay back its debts. And so what you have right now is a situation in which the Egyptian government's hands are are significantly tied by the United States and by Israel. And so despite Egypt's pleas, despite Egypt's attempt to not want to be complicit in the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people of Gaza, it appears as if they seem to be moving forward with plans to allow for the expulsion of however many hundreds of thousands or millions of Palestinians. And I think the proof is in the pudding. A government so deeply indebted, so already despised by its people, for having been complicit in the siege on Gaza for 16 years, is now building a wall, is now investing however many millions of dollars in the construction of a wall. I can almost guarantee you they would have never started constructing that wall if they weren't quite certain of Israel's intention and their belief that there's just nothing they can do about it.
This is kind of a trap in a way, Zachary, because if we look back in history, you've seen Israel's incursions into Lebanon during the Civil War, so-called Civil War in the 1980s, and that was to basically deal with what it saw as, the PLO or Yasser Arafat aligned factions, militant factions in Lebanon. It saw fit to invade in order to deal with that problem. So pushing Palestinians out historically, Zachary, has never been any kind of solution, really. All it does is invite more conflict. Could we see the same thing happening? I know I'm jumping ahead here, but could we see the same thing happening with Egypt, where Israel would turn around and say, well, we have extremists that we have located in the camps in the Sinai, and we feel that we need to go in and secure that. What do you think about that possible future scenario?
Well, if you thought locking 2.2 million Palestinians into an open-air prison for 16 years was a recipe for violence and retaliation, then pushing millions of Palestinians into Egypt would lead to probably much worse. What we've seen here is that whenever Israel pushes Palestinians across the border, as it did in 48, when it expelled 750,000 Palestinians, leading to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in refugee camps in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria. The result of that expulsion was that you had bases of Palestinian refugee camps, places in Gaza, in places like Rafah and Khan Yunis, where you had many thousands of Palestinians pick up arms and carry out cross-border raids, right? And that's exactly what happened throughout the 50s until 1956, when Israel entered Gaza as part of the neo-colonial war known as the Suez Crisis, in which it entered Khan Yunis on November 2nd, 1956, rounded up every male above the age of 15, lined them up in the city center, and executed them. We're talking 150, perhaps as many as 200 Palestinians executed for having committed the crime of being an adult Palestinian male. The same happened in Rafah in 56, a few weeks later. The same happened throughout the late 1960s and 70s, when Israel was actively engaged in now attacking Palestinians across the Jordanian border, right? In Black September 1970, Palestinians are carrying out these cross-border raids, attacking Israeli targets inside Israel. And in that case, it was the Jordanian government that went in 1970 and slaughtered thousands of Palestinians in a single month in September 1970. And of course, the same thing happened in Lebanon. After Israel expelled hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to Lebanon, they're festering in refugee camps, no right to work in Lebanon, don't have access, they can't buy property in Lebanon, they can't establish businesses in Lebanon, they're condemned to living in these refugee camps, and lo and behold, Lebanon also becomes a base of Palestinian resistance. Israel enters Lebanon in 1982 and slaughters thousands of not just Palestinians in Lebanon, but also Lebanese. So this is, we've seen this over and over and over again. Israel forces Palestinians across the border in order to preserve Jewish majority, its demographic Jewish majority inside Israel. Palestinians don't believe they lose the right to live in Palestine just because they were violently ethnically cleansed from it. So they carry out acts of resistance in order to claim their legitimate right to live in Palestine. And Israel responds with grotesque violence, or the states that they're living in respond with grotesque violence. And here we're likely to see the exact same thing unfold on the Egyptian-Palestinian border in Rafah in the coming weeks and months.
And on top of this, and what you said is really chapter and verse, I think, a serious reality that we're looking at if this is allowed to happen. But what's somewhat worse, though, Zachary, is that tell us about Israel's plans for expansion, because this isn't a conspiracy theory, especially with the current Likudic coalition and government, arguably the most far-right extremist government in Israeli history. There are plans afoot. There have been plans afoot. Maybe you could tell us about the historic aspects of this to expand the current state of Israel, which has undeclared borders, and that's probably why, so that they can leave the option open for expansion. But tell me how that factors into this situation, be it Sinai or Gaza or even beyond. Your thoughts on this?
Well, the goal of the Zionist movement was to establish a Jewish state in Palestine, and Palestine has always been, for the Jewish community of Palestine, it has always been British Mandatory Palestine. And so the Zionists were not content with the 47 partition plan. They expanded the state's borders beyond what was allotted to them by the UN in that November 1947 plan. And then and so that state survived for about 18 years, from 48 to 67. And as soon as they had the opportunity, they expanded the borders of the state and took over Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem. And of course, also the Golan and Sinai. But those were but Sinai was never really of interest to Israel. In fact, in the aftermath of the 1967 war, the Israeli cabinet met in June 1967 and basically said, look, we're not really interested in Sinai. We hope to give that back eventually to Egypt. But we are interested in controlling Gaza, right? Because Gaza is part of historic Palestine. But we're not interested in the Palestinians living in Gaza. We don't want them there. They're a demographic problem. They're a security threat. So they made the decision on June 18th, 1967, that as soon as they figure out a way of ethnically cleansing the 400,000 Palestinians that were living in Gaza at the time, right? So this is June 1967. As soon as we figure out a way of ethnically cleansing the 500,000 Palestinians living there, then we will annex Gaza. And they, in fact, executed on this. But this wasn't just a theoretical plan. They actually executed on this. And from June 1967 until 1970, there was a secret agency established inside Israel to try to compel Palestinians in Gaza to leave voluntarily. The way they did this was by buying up land in places like Paraguay, in places like Libya, where they would basically convince Palestinians and they would also try and find jobs for Palestinians in these places. And they convinced hundreds of Palestinians from Gaza to leave Gaza permanently, to essentially voluntarily accept expulsion based on some promise of some better life in another country. And then, of course, they reneged on those promises, right? And in fact, the reason this whole plan came to an end in 1970 was that they made some promises to Palestinians in Paraguay who and reneged on those promises. And then after reneging on those promises, that one Palestinian in Paraguay assassinated the secretary of the Israeli consulate general in Paraguay at the time. And that led them to realize, oh, this is probably a bad idea. And they abandoned that plan. But this is one episode in a 56-year-long history of trying to get Palestinians out of the occupied territories. They did this from 67 to 87. They expelled another 2,000 Palestinians by force. from the Palestinian territories. In Jerusalem, they've expelled 15,000 Palestinians from Jerusalem, stripping those Palestinians of their residency permits. They're doing this all around the West Bank, where they're expelling Palestinians from Bas al-Faryata, where they're expelling Palestinians from Khan al-Ahmar, from Beitah, from Khumsa, wherever there are Palestinians living in places that Israel ultimately wants to take control over. There are expulsions. So this is nothing new, and now we're just seeing the latest version of it on a much more violent scale at a magnitude we've never seen before. And it's happening in real time, live streamed on Instagram, on Twitter, on TikTok. And it's incredibly unfortunate that there's no government in the world that is willing to make a call to Netanyahu to end the madness. And of course, Biden could make that call tomorrow. Recall that Ronald Reagan himself called Israeli prime minister at the time, Menachem Begin. He basically made a call to him in 1982 and said, you need to end the killing now. And he did. And that was the end of it. And it just takes one call, probably no longer than 60 seconds, where Biden gets on the phone with Netanyahu and says, the killing ends tomorrow or else. You don't even have to actually make any real threats. You just say or else, and the killing would end. But Biden is a stooge, and he's complicit in the genocide, and it doesn't really seem like that's likely to happen. So here we are witnessing Nakba 2.0, the ethnic cleansing of millions of Palestinians. We're witnessing it in real time.
No, it's just very true. The United States does hold all the cards. They hold all the leverage. They hold all the power, not just diplomatically, but Israel couldn't be able to prosecute any of these military campaigns without the assistance of the United States. Militarily, they're supplying the bombs, they're supplying the ammunition, they're supplying the bullets, they're supplying all the technical support for the American aircraft, they're supplying the satellite reconnaissance for targeting, for drone targeting, and drone technology itself is being supplied by the U.S., including operators of these technologies, which are embedded in various parts of the Israeli Defense Force. Okay, so the U.S. can, as you said, Zachary, they could make one phone call. Joe Biden, and it's happened before, as you said, and even George Bush Jr. Intervened with the situation in Gaza, and they dismantled settlements. Of course, that led to more settlements being built, of course, in the West Bank. But the point is, everybody, Zachary, who's saying, well, the United States is under, the tail's wagging the dog, and they can't do anything about Israel. Israel controls the U.S. government, when in fact it's actually the other way around in terms of leverage. Isn't it interesting how this conversation's been flipped in order to kind of enable what we're seeing here?
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's the tail wagging the dog. I think that is the perfect analogy. We have an organization called AIPAC, which I'm sure your listeners are very familiar with, who has raised $100 million to deploy, to put to work in helping elect pro-genocide candidates to the U.S. Congress. Right? This is the largest single issue spender, a lobbyist organization in the primaries. Not for helping Americans get healthcare, not for helping fix our infrastructure, not for solving our education problems, but for getting candidates into the United States Congress who are willing to send Israel a blank check every year. Previously, it was $3.8 billion. This year is probably going to be more like 11 billion plus the 3.8, so more like 15 billion. So this is what we've got, and they're very active, and they're well organized, and they're well funded. They target Israel's most vocal critics in Congress. So Rashida Tlaib, the Democratic congressperson from Michigan, they tried to convince both Hill Harper and Nasser Beydoun to accept $20 million in campaign financing to run against Rashida Tlaib. And both of them, not only did they wisely reject the blood money, but they leaked the news of the amount of money that they were offered, apparently to convince other Democrats to also reject the blood money. But of course, this money offered to Hill Harper and Nasser Beydoun was just one among many offers made to many potential candidates trying to unseat essentially every member of the United States Congress that opposes the genocide happening in Gaza. You have AIPAC working to unseat them. This is the case with Jamal Bowman, This is the case with Cori Bush. This is the case with Summer Lee. This is the case with Ilhan Omar. They're trying to unseat all of them.
It's incredible. It's extraordinary, too, that there's not more pushback at the DNC level where you have a foreign entity or a foreign lobby that is like blatantly interfering in the U.S. Election process, the very thing they constantly accuse Russia of doing. I mean, it's really breathtaking. Look at the UK. Look at the Labour Party. It's been totally gutted. In the UK, even the leader got thrown out, Jeremy Corbyn, of his own party by the Israeli lobby, effectively. So, this is an incredible amount of influence from a foreign government, ostensibly a foreign government that is micromanaging the internal politics of the United States and Britain. I mean, Zachary, this is unprecedented. We've seen lobbyists before. We've seen the influence peddling and all of this stuff before, but now we're talking about total control of a major foreign policy piece here. I mean, that's unprecedented, isn't it?
I'm certainly not familiar with any other lobbies associated with any other foreign governments that are deploying literally hundreds of millions of dollars to try to influence our elections. I mean, when Russia did this, as you correctly pointed out, right, there was outrage. When Israel does it,
but they couldn't even prove that Russia did it. That's the problem. But here we have the receipts. We have the receipts. It's a huge amount of money.
And it's money that is being spent to elect candidates that are not just pro-genocide, by the way, that also support an end to U.S. American democracy. In 2022, so AIPAC spent $30 million in the last campaign season, right? During the midterm elections in 2022, they spent $30 million, which included providing campaign financing for 109 members of the U.S. House of Representatives who voted to overturn the 2020 election. They're literally preferring they would rather, if supporting Israel's policies of ethnic cleansing and apartheid and now genocide means ending American democracy, so be it.
No, this is the real test, I think. This is probably one of the biggest tests for the actual resilience of the U.S. Federal government in terms of its ability to be autonomous, to be sovereign, to make decisions in the best interests of the country, of course, but I would say for the world, in fact. And I think it's failing badly, really failing badly. Now, when we come back, I want to talk about some of the talking points. The propaganda surrounding this issue is like nothing we've ever seen before. And I want to bring a couple of those arguments that are now being made in the mainstream media as to what justifies Israel's extreme operations that they're prosecuting right now against the native Palestinian population. We'll talk about that with Dr. Zachary Foster after the break. I'm Patrick Henningsen. This is TNT, Today's News Talk. We'll be right back.
With his expert analysis and opinion, this is TNT Radio's Timothy Shea.
The phantasmagorical farce of a Soviet-style show trial in which we had verdict first and then trial presided over by Judge Arthur Engoron in Manhattan has concluded. And it's a big story, not just for the absurd verdict handed down by Engoron, but no, a deeper story involving Engoron himself, or more specifically, how he chooses to present himself to the public. Uncombed hair, unkempt clothes, sloppily knotted ties. Basically a man who doesn't care, a man who has no self-respect. And he has unwittingly become a symbol for what ails America. We've become a slovenly nation. Our streets are filthy. Our subways are unsafe. People board airplanes looking like they just rolled out of bed in 3-week-old gym clothes. Where's the self-respect, America? Where's the pride in being Americans? Where's the pride in having beautiful parks and clean subway stations and wonderful cultural amenities? What has happened to America? It's time we get our self-respect back. And those of us who are self-respecting, we need to do a better job of holding our fellow citizens to a higher standard. From MAGAInstitute.com, this is Timothy Shea for Today's News Talk.
Political commentator and investigative journalist. You're with Patrick Henningsen on Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All All right, folks, welcome back. Welcome back. We're still in the first hour of this live broadcast. Thank you for rejoining us. We're having a very deep conversation about the deteriorating situation, the dire situation right now in occupied Palestine. We're looking at the situation that's building up at the Rafah border crossing as Israel plans to push hundreds of thousands or more native Palestinians into the Egyptian desert in one of the biggest ethnic cleansing exhibitions that we've ever seen in the modern era. If not of all time. And this is a regrettable situation, should have been stopped a lot earlier, but because of the complicity and the total supine attitude and policies of the U.S., Britain, and other EU countries, it's been allowed to progress unabated. That's not to say anything about the Gulf states and their role in enabling this situation, as well as Egypt and others. But we'll get to that in a moment. I want to bring back onto the program our guest, Dr. Zachary Foster, who is also a scholar and a historian on these matters, Middle East affairs, and specifically with Israel and Palestine. Now, Zachary, one of the arguments that's being made in the mainstream media, you probably recognize some of these arguments. One of them is that, world wars happen and civilians die, and that's just part of war. You can't avoid civilian casualties. This sort of rank apologism of the collateral damage, as it's called, to use a military euphemism. I've got a clip of this very argument being made on a top-rated show, the Piers Morgan show. Let's go ahead and roll this, and then we will break down this, what looks like a very fallacious argument, but you have to see it to believe it. Go ahead and roll this.
I suppose the analogy with World War II and the fact that indisputably, many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of civilians died in that conflict. And the argument is it was for the greater good of defeating the Nazis. Do you see any parallel with wanting, and I completely understand Israel's desire, fervent desire, to eliminate Hamas after what they did on October the 7th, particularly as Hamas has stated again and again, they want to keep repeating it again and again. So on that particular argument about when you wage a war against whether it's the Nazis or Hamas, a lot of civilians tragically will get killed in the process, but ultimately that shouldn't stop you going ahead with the war to try and achieve your goal. What do you say to that?
Zachary, where to start on this argument? Have you heard this before? And how would you respond if you were sitting there with the great Piers Morgan?
Well, comparing Hamas to the Nazis? I mean, Hamas, before it was known as Hamas, it was called Al-Mujamma' al-Islami from 1973 to 1987. It was a charity organization. It funded schools and orphanages and health clinics. It was contributing to women's empowerment and women's employment. Okay. Last I checked, the Nazi regime did not begin as a charity organization that evolved into a resistance movement, resistance to a brutal military occupation. I mean, the comparison is obviously insane, and no serious human being would compare a charity organization that evolved into a resistance movement resisting brutal military occupation to the Nazis. So, I mean, it's just insulting and ahistorical and acontextual. And ultimately, if you look at Hamas's evolution, they took more, like Hamas, why did it embrace violence in 1988? Okay, it was after a year in which the Israeli military entered Gaza. From December 1987 until December 1988, the Israeli military slaughtered 142 Palestinians in Gaza and suffered zero casualties. And that is the reason they started to embrace violence beginning in 1989 and 1990. Originally against military targets inside Israel. They killed the Israeli police chief in Gaza. They were primarily targeting military targets. Their first attack on civilians was not until December 1990, which came 2 months after the Israeli military slaughtered 21 unarmed Palestinian protesters in Jerusalem in what would amount to a massacre. That is what led Hamas to start to attack Israeli civilians. So, I mean, the comparison is just disgusting. It's dehumanizing. And ultimately, that is the goal here. The goal, whenever you're comparing Palestinian resistance fighters to Nazis, the goal is to justify the wholesale slaughter of all 2.2 million Palestinians. That's the goal. And so Piers Morgan is, I think, also complicit in even making that comparison and making it sound reasonable. He himself is complicit in making it easier for Israel to carry out its ongoing genocide in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, I mean, besides what you brought up, which are, a valid historical context and analysis as to what an armed liberation struggle is in the world, and this is nothing new. It's happening all over the world all the time throughout history. But what's most shocking about this point, which seems to be repeated, I see it on other newscasts, it's almost like there's a memo going around, is that it just shows a total void of ethics, a total void of morals, because I remember you could get fired for making arguments like this in the past, that you're basically endorsing the killing of civilians and saying, well, it's too bad, whatever, 5, 10, 20,000, 27, 20, 30,000. It's just unfortunate. And, 30,000 isn't that much, Zachary, because during the Second World War, many millions died. So this is really just a drop in the bucket in terms of, dead civilians. So it shouldn't stop Israel from waging their war. They need to wage against Hamas because they feel threatened. I mean, that's essentially the argument that Piers Morgan and others are making. They're trying to dress it up. But to me, this just speaks to the kind of degradation of the discourse in the West. I'm seeing politicians parrot the same talking point. I mean, I can't believe I'm actually watching this, because this would have been totally out of bounds 10 years ago. And here it's just common parlance. Unbelievable. What do you think?
If the argument here is that Hamas's targeting of innocent civilians on October 7th, when they killed something like 764 Israeli civilians, if that suggests that the organization is basically Nazi-like, and thus no amount of civilian suffering, no number of civilian casualties, it matters, and that the organization, again, through the wholesale destruction of Gaza, needs to be destroyed for that reason. Well, using that same logic, then you could obviously say already back in 2008, when Israel killed more like 1,000 Palestinians, again, mostly targeting civilians, just like Hamas did, mostly targeting civilians, then you would say that, well, in 2008, Israel was behaving Nazi-like, and thus Hamas had the right, according to this Piers Morgan logic, to go in and slaughter every single Israeli, kill all 10 million Israelis because the government carried out a massacre in Gaza. I mean, that's the argument being made here, that when the government carries out an atrocity, that when the Israeli government or when the Palestinian pseudo-government in Gaza carries out an atrocity, then the appropriate response is, or a potentially legitimate response, is to go in and wholesale massacre every single man, woman, and child living in the country or living in Gaza. I mean, that's the argument being made. And yet, it's appropriate or acceptable to say these kinds of things when it's the Palestinian civilians who are the ones that would face the brunt of that retaliation. But could you even imagine a Piers Morgan after the 2008-2009 war, when Israel overwhelmingly targeted civilians? They killed a tiny number of Hamas militants. The vast majority of the deaths were Palestinian civilians. And in fact, the Goldstone report that was produced by the United Nations in the aftermath of that war concluded they assessed 11 strikes in which the Israeli military killed Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Out of those 11 strikes that were analyzed, 10 out of the 11 strikes had no military objective. The military objective was killing innocent Palestinian civilians. There was no other target. Okay, so what you're talking about is a government that went into Gaza in 2008-9, slaughtering 1,000 Palestinian civilians, and apparently, according to Piers Morgan, that means that in retaliation, Hamas has the right to go and commit a genocide against the Israeli people. That's the argument he's making.
Well, it wouldn't be so craven if not for the fact that active measures are being deployed by the media, by Western governments to prevent any diplomacy, to prevent any ceasefire. You saw this farrago in the UK House of Commons over the ceasefire vote. We'll talk about that in the second hour with Basil Valentine. But the active efforts on all sides to prevent any diplomacy, any negotiations, any peace settlements, any ceasefire. So you combine that with this rhetoric, you combine that with this type of discourse, and it really just seems like everybody is up for escalation throughout this. I mean, where is this going to end? It's almost like there are parties that would like to see a wider conflict. They would like to see the whole region inflamed in a wider conflict, because I can't see any other better way to make that happen than what we're witnessing right now, Zachary.
Well, there are certain countries that are trying to bring an end to the violence. South Africa, with the ICJ case, the Ansar Allah movement and the Houthis in Yemen, trying to block shipping through the Red Sea to Israeli, United States, and British shipping. You have Japan. You have multiple. We're not talking about Japanese state-owned businesses. We're talking about privately owned weapons manufacturers in Japan. Itochu, for example, saying that after the ICJ ruling, we don't want to be in violation of international law, so we're cutting our ties to Elbit, the Israeli manufacturing company that is responsible for all these drone attacks and is the one building all these drones that are being used to slaughter innocent Palestinian children in Gaza. So they cut ties. You have in the Netherlands, you also have a court order that requiring the government in the Netherlands to end all military ties to the Israeli military, again, out of a desire not to be in violation of the ICJ ruling, which, of course, not only is an order to Israel to end its genocidal acts in Gaza, but thus, as a result of that, requiring all states, right? Because the 1948 Convention on Genocide is, it requires all states, not just the state carrying out the acts of genocide, but requires all states to proactively prevent that genocide from happening. So the Netherlands, you saw in Spain as well, calls to investigate whether or not the European Union has any military ties to the state of Israel. So we're seeing all around the world now that the ICJ ruling is having a real impact, and that states are beginning to cut ties, as well as companies beginning to cut ties to the Israeli military. Because I don't think any sane government, maybe you might describe the UK, the British government, the United States government, the German government. There are some insane governments in the world that do want to be complicit in the genocide. But I think most governments, most sane governments, most ethical governments, most humane leaders around the world are saying, we want to have nothing to do with this.
No, this is true. And I also see that the BDS effort as well, and I'll combine that with the South African ICJ efforts there. That is actually making an impact, at least on the corporate side, with some of these companies. And you also mentioned Elbit Systems providing that drone technology to the IDF. And so that becomes a real political issue as all of these election cycles start to converge right now in 2024, and those fall foul of domestic legislation in so many different countries where there's an absolute prohibition of supplying arms and weapons to any country, much less the state of Israel, that's engaged in any questionable or genocidal activities or war crimes for that matter. It can just be a simple case of war crimes. It doesn't even need to rise to the level of genocide, although it's going to get there with the evidence that's been presented, of course. So this becomes a political problem right across the Western Hemisphere. Zachary Foster, I really appreciate you joining us on TNT this week.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's a great conversation, and I want to continue that conversation going forward. Follow Zachary Foster on social media, X, Twitter. I've tagged him on our show post right now at 21 Wire. Definitely want to keep an eye on what Zach is doing, his great threads on this subject, all this and more. Top of the hour news headlines coming up. We'll be right back with more analysis, more breaking news, more headlines. I'm Patrick Henningsen. Stay right there.